Welcome back to Survey of Biology, and we'll continue our discussion of energy systems with a in-depth look at respiration. We just finished up looking at photosynthesis, so now let's look at the inverse, and let's look at how animals and plants convert that glucose produced from photosynthesis into usable energy in the cell. So cellular respiration, and I want to differentiate it from the respiration that we're going to do. We'll look at that at the end, our respiratory system. This is different. The process we're going to look at happens at the cellular level. So every cell in your body has mitochondria. That's the organelle. That's the powerhouse of the cell, and that's where cellular respiration works. So cellular respiration is the breakdown of glucose to release energy, and specifically energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the molecule that our body can use. That's the currency of the cell in terms of energy. So again, you've seen this equation before. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6H2O plus CO2. That is the equation for respiration. So basically, what it's saying is that glucose plus oxygen yields water, carbon dioxide, and energy. That's what we want. And in this case, water and carbon dioxide, though we don't always think of it this way, are actually the waste products. And if you remember back, this, water and carbon dioxide, those compounds, the waste products of respiration, are what's required for photosynthesis to take place. So here's the organelle we need to look at. So here's the mitochondria. And there's just a few parts of the structure that you need to be familiar with. So if you look at it, it's a double membrane. So there is an outer membrane. There is an inner membrane. And the inner membrane is folded. And it's called the cristae. Those folds are called the cristae. And it's there to increase surface area. So we've got lots of chemical reactions taking place. That's what metabolism is. And the folding of the cristae increases the surface area. And then another compartment that's important is the space between the inner and outer membrane. So we've got the intermembrane space. And finally, the very middle of the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle takes place, is called the matrix. So there's kind of the anatomy of the organelle of the mitochondria that we need to look at for respiration. And here we go. So here is the simplistic version. The main function of respiration is to produce ATP. We want that molecule so that our cell can do work. And so what happens is the process starts in the cytoplasm of the cytosol, and we take organic molecules, which we know as glucose or sugar, and it gets converted into ATP through a series of steps where we break it down, combine it with oxygen, and give off the waste products, CO2 and H2O. Now, from this picture, I use this one for a reason, is that if you look, a lot of people think animal cells, oh, that's where respiration takes place. Well, plant cells have mitochondria that carry out respiration and photosynthesis. So the plant cells have mitochondria as well, and they do carry out both processes. So as we move on, again, ATP provides the usable energy for cell work. So at each of these steps, we're going to be looking, okay, where does that ATP come from? And if we break it down, there's three main steps. And here's what you should write down. Here's the order that they occur in. So the first step, right over here, is glycolysis. And as we said before, that takes place in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. And that starts the breakdown of sugar. And then we go from there. The product of that moves into the mitochondria, where it goes through the Krebs cycle, or it's also known as the citric acid cycle. And from there, it goes on to finally the electron transport chain. And at each of those three steps, there is some ATP produced. And there's also oxygen consumed, and the waste products that we talked about, CO2 and H2O, are given off. But this is the order that you should remember: glycolysis to the Krebs or citric acid cycle to the electron transport chain. And here's that molecule that we've talked about. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I just wanted you to see it. I know you've seen it before, but this is really what we're after during this process of respiration. When we break down glucose, our goal is to make ATP so that we can carry out cellular work, whether it's mechanical work, transport work, chemical work. It all comes down to ATP. And specifically, if you remember, that between that second and third phosphate groups, when that bond is broken, lots of energy can be given off. And again, we talked about coupled reactions when we talked about energy in general. And here's what's happening. We're using ATP to release energy, and in the process, ADP gets released. And we're going to talk a little bit about, there's also some electron carriers. So some of the energy and the electrons that are associated with that are transferred from one step to another, specifically from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain by this electron carrier NAD+, which is nicotinamide. You don't need to remember the name, but you do need to know that NAD+ will pick up those electrons and become NADH. And NADH is a high energy molecule. So it's going to carry energy from one step to the next in the process. And so here is a picture that shows, we talked before about how it's kind of the reverse of photosynthesis. So here's a picture that shows how the two of them, the two processes, are connected, and that the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are the reactants for respiration. And the products of respiration, CO2 and H2O, are the reactants for photosynthesis. So the two really are coupled reactions. And the big thing, we need sunlight, we need the input of energy for photosynthesis to take place. The water comes from the soil, but the carbon dioxide and the oxygen, they come from the atmosphere. So this is kind of the big picture, tying together what we learned in the last unit with what we're looking at in this unit. And as we kind of get close to the end of this section, here's the photosynthesis, here's the formula, here is cellular respiration, and you can see they're kind of reverse of each other. And we talked about how glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide and H2O, which we may not think of it, but they're really the waste products, and energy in the form of ATP, that's what we can use. Now, unfortunately, our body's not terribly efficient. And about 40%, only 40% of the energy from glucose is used for ATP production. The rest is lost as heat. So that's kind of the cost of doing business, is that almost 60% of the energy in each glucose molecule gets dissipated by the body as heat, and we never really get to use it. So in the last slide for this one, I just want to show you the big picture again. So again, if you remember the steps, the first step we have glycolysis, which leads to the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and then finally to the electron transport chain. And the one that I want to mention right now is glycolysis, because this happens, it's a universal process, and it happens in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions, which means that aerobic means that there is oxygen, anaerobic means that there's no oxygen. And regardless of whether oxygen is present or not, glycolysis is a universal process, and that's the first step that we'll look at. So we'll break it down, and we'll look at anaerobic respiration first. So again, thank you for your time, and we will talk to you soon.